remember that experience precedes words. If we're not careful, we can sort of think that experience needs to fit into words, but words are an abstraction from experience. Words are a metaphorical system, a symbolic system to try to capture experience. But we can get into this weird thing that the words come first, but experience comes first. And your experience and my experience will be different, but you may have quite sort of sophisticated ways of talking about it, even intellectually sophisticated ways of talking about it, and you might have very, very straightforward, even seemingly simple ways of talking about it. But we mustn't confuse intellectual sophistication for depth. Yeah? Intellectual sophistication can be depth, but it can be actually superficiality just as much. Yeah? So someone can have a very, very simple sense of there being a beyond, which really motivates them to change their life and to experience that more and more. Somebody else might have a very sophisticated intellectual conception of the beyond, not experience it very much and not change their life. Yeah? So the whole value of thought and theory and intellectual cognition in Buddhism is so that you change your life and experience the beyond more. Yeah, that's the whole point. And it's easy to lose track of that. You can start, especially in the Buddhist tradition, 2,500 year tradition, which tends to go from very simple explanation and gets more and more complex. You can start to think that that's getting more and more profound. All it's getting is more intellectually subtle. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not been a good thing. Yeah? We have to, all of us, keep remembering that what we're trying to do is experience something which may or may not be accessible to words and reason, and then live on the basis of that experience and change our life in accordance with that experience. I was reading just the other day about the Buddha's early disciples, and almost certainly they were most of them been illiterate, and they would have just memorized one or two verses. That was all they would have. There'd be no Dharma reading or Buddhist reading or nothing like anything remotely like the bookshop. You'd have literally one or two verses, and you would meditate on it very, very deeply, and for many people that was enough. Yeah. So that shows you can get an awful long way without very much theory, intellectual sophistication, which is not to say against intellectual sophistication. That can be really valuable, but only if it helps you actually experience something more and change your life more. Yeah? It's not valuable in its own right. Yeah? Buddhism's got a very uneasy relationship with theory generally, and it actually eschews dogma entirely. Yeah, really. Any kind of dogma, religious dogma or otherwise. Anyway, so bear in mind your own experience, yeah? Because what we're trying to do is deepen that and live that out more and more fully, not come up with more and more interesting theories to talk about. So we've been exploring on this urban retreat, one of the things we've been exploring is called the Threefold Way, Sila, Samadhi, Prajna, which is usually translated as ethics, meditation and wisdom. And I've got the short straw. I've got wisdom. Much easier in a way to talk about ethics and meditation. Ethics is I always think that's a bit of a confusing word. It sounds like something you might do a PhD on, Aristotle's ethics or Spinoza's ethics or something. It just means how you behave. That's all ethics means. How you treat other people, how you go about your life, how you behave. Yeah. So that the path as it's laid out, and it's a very, very traditional formulation of the path, and whatever Buddhism is, primarily it's a path. Yeah. So it starts with how you behave in your mind, because thoughts in Buddhism is an action, how you behave in your speech, how you behave in your actions, to other people, towards yourself. The very thoughts you have huge consequences. One of the things we don't realise is just how much our thoughts are actions. Yeah? Your thoughts, if you glance back at the 20th century, it's been the bloodiest century that the earth have ever known, and it's mainly to do with people's thoughts. Yeah? It's not to do with volcanoes. It wasn't to do with natural disasters. It was to do with theories and dogmas that arose in people's head. And remember, that was after Nietzsche's death of God, after belief in God has become unbelievable, which we thought was going to sort of save us in some way. What we then had is the bloodiest century ever, dominated by dogma, dominated by theory and dogma. So thoughts are incredibly, or can be an incredibly powerful action. Yeah. So you start the Buddhist life by trying to shape your behaviour, your ethics, how you behave, to create the person you want to be. Lots I could say about that, but not much. I don't want to go on too long, and I've already been warned against that, so because I can do. Is that a surprise yet? Anyway, somebody once said I had a long style. Sounds rather good, doesn't it? Anyway, so traditionally you shape your life so that your life opens out in more and more. Particularly you commit yourself to being honest and courageous and kind. Yeah, that's how Buddhism would start. You then take that changed being into meditation. That's the translation of samadhi. Samadhi really means meditation proper, which is sort of super-conscious mental states, beyond and above everyday mental states, which are extremely pleasant, incredibly rarefied and refined. And from the basis of that kind of mind, which is very flexible, very reductible, uplifted, purified and radiant, and much of what you're learning here in meditation is to try to cultivate that kind of mind, a radiant, uplifted, purified mind. And particularly the Buddha emphasized your mind being flexible, which of course is also saying that most people's minds are inflexible, and therefore you won't learn things. So on the basis of that kind of mind, you turn your attention to how things really are, prajna, wisdom. That's the Buddhist path as it's usually laid out. Wisdom's not a very good word for it because it sounds mainly like a cognition. Wisdom sounds like something you think. Wisdom really is much more like an atmosphere than a cognition. It's something, as my own teacher Sangharakshita said, it's something you catch, not you caught, not taught. It's more like something you catch on to, not something you can be taught. Yeah. So even that word wisdom, which is a translation of prajna, the Sanskrit word prajna, is a bit misconceiving if you're not careful. You start to think it's something you have to ponderously think about, and it's not like that. Yeah. Really, all you need to do is ripen your mind through sila and samadhi, ethics and meditation. And then you just need to bring a little bit of reflection into the nature of reality, and that will be enough. At least that's Bhante Sangharakshita's approach. Yeah. But experientially, I'm not sure that we always experience it like that. In fact, my own hunch is that we experience the opposite of that. Certainly I did. You start very often with a presentiment or a prefiguration or a kind of hunch of wisdom, of prajna. Yeah? You start with a sense that there must be more to life. Now that sense, that's why I asked you to think about that straight away, that sense can be pretty chaotic. I was brought up in a small English town, which I'm going back to on Sunday, just to visit again. And, when I go back, I sort of love the place and hate it at the same time. Putin has been saying that you're either a patriot or a traitor, which is a disgraceful thing to say. And I was thinking of that in Henley and Arden, I'm sort of both and neither. You know what I mean? Like, I can't decide, and I'm 62, it's a bit late. But, why was I on about that? Why did I get there? Anyway, never mind. What was I saying? Oh yes, that's right. So when I was there, I had this sort of chaotic sense that this was not good enough. I especially thought people weren't telling the truth. I remember it very distinctly, even as a child, feeling very strongly this is not good enough and that people are not telling the truth. In fact, I thought they were lying. This is unreal. So I couldn't wait to get out of the place. So your prefiguration of prajna can be like that. That this life as I'm being given it, which is, in my case, go to uni, get a partner, do stuff. Retire and die, seemed to be what I was being offered. There wasn't much of doing stuff anyway, we're going to go about that. I just thought that it's not good enough, it's not right. But it was very incoherent, and a real strong sense of it's not right. Yeah? Other people have had something much more like a mystical, what we would tend to call like a mystical experience. I was reading a philosopher who, he said as a child, he went out and looked at these horses in a field, and they seemed to be moving in a time beyond time. Lots of people have all sorts of experiences that we do not have sufficient words for. And part of the reason you're having those experiences because you cannot describe them. And when you try and describe them, it feels very clumsy and approximate, and you tend to sort of trip over them and then think, actually, I won't bother talking about it. Yeah? You should always doubt someone if they can talk about it very, 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 very coherently, because the experience is not usually very coherent. But you see what I mean? That I think for many of us, there's a prefiguration of wisdom. There's a kind of glimmer of a glimmer of a glimmer of some kind of reality that transcends everyday consciousness. And even if that is experiences, I want to smash what I've got around me because it's not good enough, which is how I felt. Yeah. And then for me and for some of you perhaps, that's then led you back to meditation. You think, well, perhaps I'll learn meditation. That somehow, out of that kind of glimmering of something transcendent, that's something, whatever word you want to call it, let's just call it X for a minute. Out of that, you think, you hear this about meditation, which is about learning about your mind, you sort of have a vague kind of intuition that that's what you need to do. That's what I had. A friend of mine was coming along here to the London Buddhist Centre on a Wednesday night, and she suggested that I come. I was living with her and I was at art school, and I had this really strange experience because I put it off for about two or 3 weeks. It's about sort of this time of year, but about 300 years ago, about 35 years ago, something like that. And I had this very strong sense of foreboding, which I've only had twice in my life, which is I had really seemed to know that if I came to the London Buddhist Centre on that Wednesday night, my life would change forever. And so I put it off. I remember putting it off. I thought I won't be able to look back from that. I knew nothing about Buddhism. So where did I get that from? You see what I mean? I knew nothing about Buddhism. I wasn't interested in anything vaguely religious. And I thought spiritual was for weak people, frankly. So I wanted to be Damien Hirst, which is interesting because he was in the next studio. And he was Damien Hirst. Anyway, that's what I didn't want. This, but I put it off. Do you see how that was a sort of prefiguration of something? I seemed to know if I came here, my life would change. Not everybody feels this, of course, but I did. And then, lo and behold, I came here. I was taught the mindfulness of breathing, and I knew I was a Buddhist, and I'd always been a Buddhist, and I always would be. And I assumed everybody else would see that it was completely straightforward. Yeah. So do you see how? And then I started to meditate. And I'm sure some of you've had this prefiguration of something, prajna. That's made you think I'll take up this thing called meditation, samadhi. And then when you meditate, you're confronted, aren't you, by your mind. So lo and behold, you realise that, oh, look, there's a lot here that needs to be changed in my behaviour. So I used to cycle from my squat in Brixton. I used to arrive always a few minutes late, because one wants to make an entrance. I'd almost do a sort of forward roll into the shrine room and immediately fall asleep in the meditation. When I was 25, I was either very entertaining or completely depressed. I sort of oscillated in that sort of way, which is, of course, now very, very standard, that kind of behaviour, but wasn't so much then. So, what I discovered when I tried to meditate, which of course I couldn't do, was there was a lot to change in my behaviour, sila. Yeah? So even though the path is laid out traditionally, sila, samadhi, prajna, I think for most of us, you experience it at least in the initial stage, as prajna, samadhi, sila. Yeah? A taste of wisdom, an instinct, therefore, to learn meditation. And meditation confronts you with who you really are, which means you need to change your behaviour. Yeah? That's how I've understood it. Then, of course, once you've travelled the path backwards, you then need to travel the path forwards. I then, and probably you then, have started noticing your behaviour, and what you notice is that a lot of it's not very good. And that's good that you've noticed that. Yeah? It's very easy not to notice that. Buddhism starts very strongly with taking responsibility for your life. Buddhism is unforgiving in that way. If you want something that's less rigorous in that way, I don't know, try crystals. Just throwing that out there, or indeed the Catholic Church. Anyway, I mustn't distract myself. So yeah, you think, gosh, there's a lot here. So you take responsibility for your life, and you get your life in order. You stress test yourself, you strengthen yourself, you get your life together, you get your XXX together. That's what you do. That's what sila means. You're not floating off on some sort of cloud of unknowing. You actually get a proper look at your life, see where it's working, see where it isn't, and then change the things in which it's not. Yeah. And Buddhism, I can tell you, if you read the traditional suttas, it's unremitting. That's what you do. You take with full responsibility for it. No blame, no resentment. If anything, a conscious cultivation of gratitude and an absolute emphasis on striving. It's amazing that contemporary Buddhism is so, isn't it? You think that all the Buddhism teaches sometimes is, which is just this sort of, you sort of look through the Pali Canon trying to find the Buddha saying, you just need to accept yourself and love yourself. He just says, get a grip. He is not a nice Buddha. So yeah, you get this incredible emphasis on striving in Buddhism, which really means striving not in a kind of point-missing kind of a hubristic way. It just means you need to get your life together. You need to own it, change where it's not working, make friends, be courageous, be honest, those kind of things. Very, very straightforward things. Yeah? And then with that deepened mind, you then enter into meditation. Bhante Sangharakshita says if you mostly practice sila, all you need to do is you just sit down, close your eyes, and you're straight into samadhi. Anyone been there yet? Anyways, frankly, I've never found it like that, but that's what he says. That you in other words, you try to live more and more like a meditation, yeah? Where your mind is suffused by positive emotion pretty much all the time. Yeah? And then on the basis of this grown-up, matured, flexible, doctorable, malleable mind, in which you've taken full responsibility for yourself. In other words, you're not living out an idea, because even Buddhism can become an idea that you're sort of trapped within. You're not living out a bright idea. You're not living on the basis of theory and dogma. You're actually getting your life together, actually experiencing deepened states in meditation. And you are because they're very, very pleasant. And when you come out of them, the world is different. Yeah? You open your eyes after meditation, even if it's gone a little bit deeper, and the world is more alive. Yeah? Then you turn your mind to wisdom, yeah? Which is, after all, the subject of my... Joseph is looking relieved. I've got to the word wisdom. Then you turn your mind, with that kind of very, very healthy mind, you then turn it valuably to wisdom. So I want to say a little bit about wisdom, obviously. And again, I've already said, that word wisdom is problematic in itself. You could leave it at prajna, but then nobody knows what that means. Because wisdom sounds cognitive, doesn't it? So you then have to, how do you talk about wisdom? Yeah. So Buddhist tradition is very, very clear that there is an experience. Even that word is problematic. I'm increasingly not very keen on this word experience, because most of what we call experience is actually really interpretation. It's actually what we... Anyway, it's nowhere near it. There's no such thing as experience, largely speaking. I mean, there is, but for most of us, we're not having it. We're stuck in cognitions, we're stuck in theories, in mythic structures and so on, that we're not really aware of. So, even things like experience are a bit tricky. But you need some sort of word, don't you, to point beyond egotistical consciousness, everyday consciousness. So I just used that word of more early on and asked you to talk about, is there more to life than egotistical consciousness? Yeah. So Buddhism is very clear that the goal of Buddhism, enlightenment itself, is beyond the rational mind, beyond the physical senses, beyond time and space, beyond the bifurcation of the world into me and you, self and world, and so on. You name it, it's beyond it. Yeah? So Buddhism starts in two places. It starts with you and I just now in this room with the stuff we've got to work on. In other words, it starts with sila. But it starts there because there is a prajna. It starts in that other place. Do you see what I mean? It's only worth working on your sila if there's a prajna. Yeah? In fact, often the only reason why you will work on your sila, your ethics, your behaviour, is because there is wisdom. Yeah? And you have some kind of, often incoherent, even chaotic, sense of wisdom. Yeah? So the word that I'm writing a book with Jan Varch at the moment about this, but the word that we've chosen is asamskrita, which is often translated as unconditioned or unconfected, not put together, like confectionery. Confectionery is lots of things put together. There's a state of being that's unconfected, unconditioned. That's a very traditional way of talking about wisdom, asamskrita. Yeah? The trouble with that, so the classic formulation, this is early Buddhism, would say, there's an unconditioned, the Buddha talks about this, there's an unconditioned, yeah? And what he would mean by that traditionally is unconditioned by greed, hatred and delusion, yeah? That's generally what he would mean by that. So it sounds like a metaphysical statement, but it's just saying it hasn't got, whatever this is, it hasn't got greed in it, it hasn't got hatred in it, and it hasn't got spiritual ignorance in it, yeah? Which is impeccable as a description, but it doesn't tell you anything, unfortunately. It doesn't tell you really the contents of that experience. It just tells you what needs to be cleared away for that experience to be experienced. Yeah? That when there's greed, hatred and delusion there, that experience can't arise. It'll only arise when it's not there. So it's really like saying a horse is not a rabbit, yeah, basically. The other problem with the unconditioned is that, as a word in Buddhism, is that when you hear that unconditioned by greed, hatred and delusion, that sounds like something you can imagine. Yeah? Oh yeah, sure, I can imagine myself without greed, hatred and delusion. Now the only reason we think we can imagine it is because we don't realise how deep greed, hatred and delusion goes. And a lot of that's to do with the fact that we haven't really been tested very much. We haven't lived through 2 world wars, for instance. We're not in the Ukraine just now, So we don't get to notice very often just how much what we call ourselves is predicated on greed, hatred and delusion. It's very muted for us in our very lucky world that we're living in, where bombs are not falling from the sky. We're very, very fortunate. And let's hope we continue being that fortunate, but we're very, very fortunate. So we've not been tested very much. Yeah? So if you try and teach the unconditioned as being the absence of greed, hatred and delusion, people think, oh yeah, that sounds perfectly straightforward. Yeah? I can imagine, are you following all this? I can imagine a day when I don't have any greed, don't have any hatred and don't have any delusion. You actually can't, yeah? You just can't. I can't, actually, and you can't. You might think you can, but you are wrong. But you just can't. So it's probably, even that word, unconditioned by greed, hatred, and delusion, it sounds so user-friendly, so accessible and doable, but that itself, in the modern context, is actually unhelpful, I believe. Anyway, this is where I am at the moment. Traditional Buddhism, that seemed to have been enough, because they lived, in a way that was unimaginable to us, where it's complete, for them it was enough, yeah? They just got on with practice, and then the ineffable nature of reality dawned upon them without very much theoretical work. As I said, they'd probably just have one or two verses that they'd memorize. Yeah? So for them, remember, in an incredibly eternalistic world, where the assumption was that you were living in a world of spirits and devas and like angel creatures, sprites, gods and goddesses. That was just a given assumption in a world that was alive with gods and demons, in a world in which that was assumed, like we assume a world of when you die, that's the end, So in an eternalistic world, that was enough, that teaching was enough for many of the Buddha's disciples to gain enlightenment. Yeah? I think it's not going to be enough for us, because we're in a nihilistic world where we think, oh yeah, I can do all that, greed, hatred and delusion, yeah, I can imagine them disappearing. And what you end up with then is a kind of secular Buddhism. Yeah? What you end up with is secular humanism. And one of the great dangers to Buddhism, in the modern Buddhism in the West, is that it's either you think it is secular humanism, and even teachers of Buddhism can start to think it's secular humanism, with a bit of sort of meditation thrown in. But it's basically an idea that it's all sort of doable within the person I think I am. I can just imagine me, but without greed, hatred and delusion. Do you see what I mean? And it's not. It really isn't. So we need to find other words for it. Yeah. So I've been reading and even sort of studying the work of Ian McGilchrist, who's a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, a philosopher really, who I outside of Buddhism, it's the deepest ideas I've met outside of Buddhism. We interviewed him here in the main shrine room, Jan Vatra and I, and he said afterwards, it seemed like I'm a Buddhist. We were in so much accord. There was one particular way in which we weren't, but I'll come to that in a minute. So in his new book, with his 2 volumes, and hugely wonderful, but quite a thing to read, and I won't go through it all, but he ends up with God. And his friends who are scientists and so on are saying, do not go to God, that nobody will take you seriously. But he ends up with God. And Buddhism has never believed in God. There's no place for a judging or a creator God in Buddhism at all. Buddhism, right from the very beginning, is a clearly non-theistic tradition. Yeah? You can't smuggle him in, and anyway, you can't believe him anyway, so we don't really need to smuggle him in. Yeah? So, but what struck me about his thought, many things have, is that he says, I'm using this in a particular way. He said, if you attend to your life deeply, you experience it, as it were, flowing towards some ineffable meaning. That everything, the deeper you go, the deeper you feel in contact with a current that is flowing towards some ineffable meaning. Ineffable simply means cannot be conceptualized, cannot be adequately captured in words and theories. Yeah? And remember, Buddhism is saying that the goal of the spiritual life is beyond the physical senses and the rational mind. In other words, it's beyond everything that you think of yourself and the world. Yeah? And another way of putting that is it's the ineffable. Yeah? But that needs to be, even that's not great. Anyway, it'll have to do. But he says you need some kind of word to indicate that there's much more than everyday consciousness. Yeah? If you don't have a word, that possibility falls out of consciousness. Yeah? So he calls this an unword. He says that, in other words, you need a word, and he chooses God, and I think it's not the word I would choose for obvious reasons, but he says that you need an unword, and he chooses God, to remind you, to keep a place in your psyche for a transcendent, ineffable experience that doesn't fit into your everyday ideas about yourself or your world. Yeah? And he said if you don't have that, you just fall back into nihilism. Our nihilism is a kind of chic nihilism, and it's a quite complicated one because we're also weirdly internalistic as well. But you fall back into this sort of chic nihilism where nothing means anything. Yeah? And then you start to take that seriously, as if that's really true, that your actions don't matter, that how you treat other people doesn't matter, that it's all socially constructed, that really I can just sort of reconstruct myself along any lines I fancy. It's all coming out of, like I said at the announcement, a sense that life has no intrinsic meaning, that therefore any meaning I have to stitch together with myself and a few friends. Yeah? This is our modern nihilistic position, yeah? That basically it's a sort of chaos, that consciousness is, technically is an epiphenomenon of the brain, so that when the brain dies, consciousness is completely rubbed out, there's nothing beyond that. Therefore, there was no meaning before, no meaning afterwards. Yeah? We do not realise how theoretical that is. Yeah? And it's completely weird. We're the first culture to buy into that at such numbers. Yeah? There's always been nihilistic trains of thought. Even in the Buddha's day there was nihilistic trains of thought, but they were sort of little niches. Now that we're all living in that niche. But we don't realise how theoretical it is. I don't want to talk too long. So I just to give you a little, from his writing, one of his way of explaining that. He says that consciousness is either, you could have three arguments about consciousness. It's either emitted from the brain, which is what we tend to believe, that we've got this brain which is like a computer, and when it gets complex enough it creates consciousness. That's one theory. Or you can think that consciousness is more like a radio or a television set. Do you remember those? Where you can break the radio or the television set, but you know that doesn't destroy the programs, it just can't receive the radio signal anymore. Yeah. So he said another theory of consciousness is it's more like that consciousness is something that you kind of receive, you pick up on. Or he said that consciousness is something that is like a limiter valve, that the brain is like a limiter valve, allowing more or less consciousness to flow through it. Yeah? That, it's like a limiter valve. That it, anyway, that's how he puts it. And he said he thinks that's the most likely explanation. This is based on neuroscience and so on. That's the most likely explanation. And he says if you think that consciousness is created by the brain, he says basically you're believing in a miracle. Because it's always the problem of contemporary thought and science is how does matter create consciousness? In other words, how does something create something utterly unlike itself? Here we are in consciousness just now. It feels like nothing remotely like matter. Yeah, like you can, I remember when I was at art school looking at the brain and doing drawings of dead bodies and so on. Consciousness is nothing like that. So he said it's like rhubarb growing, a big stem, big leaf thing, and then algebra, and then Mahler's ninth. How could something utterly unlike something grow? Yeah. So he said that basically our basic materialist assumption is basically a sort of superstitious believing in miracles. Now, what you can sort of argue that or not, and it's a 2-volume book to try and get there. So see how you do. But he comes up with God, and I'm not very sympathetic to God, but I can see why he does use that word, because God is. We're in the realm of poetry now, and God is an image for some kind of, at best, loving, universal spirit that is intimately connected with you, that can bless you, that you can turn to. that is you can be beloved by directly and impersonally. Yeah? So you can see there's definite strengths in the word. Yeah, I think you can't actually do it, but there are real strengths in that word. Yeah, the unconditioned, the Buddhist word that I'm using as Samskrita, it does sound actually by comparison impersonal and even mechanical. Yeah, which is good. So it's a downside in that way as well. It's clearly not God, so that's really good, but it then sounds like something like electricity or something impersonal. So both words are just saying, look, you just cannot get there. They're unwords. They're trying to remind you, don't think that this everyday consciousness is it. You actually even have a prefiguration it's not it, and you probably had it since you were a child. It's not that Buddhism gives it to you, it just sort of points you to it in yourself and recommends that you spend your life flourishing that. Yeah. So, God, I think, is unhelpful, but you can see that there's also limits in the unconditioned. It's just trying to say there is something that Buddhism calls wisdom or prajna, which you can experience, to use that word, which is problematic. The Buddha himself is like, yeah, but he wouldn't be very pleased with this talk so far. I mean, he'd do it, but he'd be very nice about it, I'm sure. But he would say, he'd be saying, don't do that. They'll just get, you'll just confuse yourself and you'll confuse each other. He taught a path. Yeah, he taught sila, samadhi, prajna. He'd say, okay, first of all, shape your actions, then start to meditate. As you do that, the ineffable nature of reality will dawn on you in its own way, often earlier on in little kind of involuntary uplifts, little insightful glimmerings. And as you give yourself to that more, it'll just open up more and more. You don't need... the Buddha was very averse to metaphysical speculation. That's he was famous at the time for being the person that didn't speculate. Yeah? And what I've been doing there is speculating, and he didn't do that. Yeah, for good reason. So I want to finish with this fact that what he would teach is a path. He'd be saying, don't think about that stuff. You're not ready for it. You're bound to misunderstand it. You'll either reify it into God and make it a person with all the problems that have come from that, some of them pretty horrendous, or you turn it into a kind of impersonal force, which you'll either be sentimental about, or you'll think is actually like just part of your secular humanist worldview and fits quite snugly into your everyday life, which the Buddha would just think, well, that's just ridiculous, So he'd just think, just start with fashioning your life in sila, then trying to enter into samadhi. Prajna will start to emerge if you practice intensively enough, and that's a very important caveat. If you go on retreat, go on the winter retreat, if you go on journey in the guide course, suddenly becoming an ad. In other words, if you practice intensely enough in good conditions, the ineffable nature of reality will start to dawn on you. And what you need for that, and this is what I want to finish with, you need shraddha, you need faith. Yeah? And the reason I started this little talk by getting you to think about experiences where you felt in touch with something more is that's the basis of shraddha, that's the basis of faith. That there is some kind of dim, inchoate, quite often quite chaotic sense that this human life as it's being given to us is not enough. Yeah? And that's the beginnings of faith. Yeah? In Buddhism. Now, faith in Buddhism is nothing remotely like blind faith. Buddhism has no conception of blind faith. So it's traditionally based on intuition, reason and experience. Yeah? So you have, again, some intuition that there's a transcendental reality, which is a translation of the word lakutara, or there's the unconditioned. You have some faith, you have an intuition for that. You then think about it like we're doing now. This is what we're doing. We're trying to do reason. We're trying to think about, hang on, what do I believe? I kind of think that consciousness is created by the brain. And actually, if I start to think about it, it's very, very problematic. Nobody has sorted that out. You know, it's a big, in philosophy, it's a big problem. Nobody has sorted out that problem. Yeah? So you use your reason to at least break down your rigid ideas about who you think you are and who the world is. Yeah? And then that starts to open you up to experiences of Shraddha, of experiences of reality. Yeah? And what I want to end on is that I think that we could consider the path of Buddhism as not necessarily so much a path of growing and developing, although that is absolutely essential to what Buddhism has always taught for 2,500 years. You could think that as you practice the path, what happens is you get more faith. Yeah? That as you practice sila and samadhi, and as you make friends, as you create a spiritual community, what starts to happen is those little glimmerings of faith that brought you here start to, in good conditions, start to grow, start to flourish, start to feel something that you feel more confident in, even that you can talk about, that you can actually guide your life towards. Yeah? That as you grow on the path, what you grow in is Shraddha. You grow in this sense that yes, this works. There is a path. I can change myself. I can move to samadhi, and the ineffable nature of reality will start to glimmer forth in my life. It's not difficult, actually. You just go on a retreat, really get into it, and it'll happen somewhere along the line. Sometimes in the most surprising ways, as you walk across the courtyard, or as you go for a pee. One of my most profound experiences was walking to go and to have a pee. There's nothing in the Pali Canon about that, I can tell you. It was very profound. So you can see that you could imagine the path as a growth in Shraddha, a growth in faith. Now I just want to finish with a little warning to that, which is that something else can happen as well, which is that you do practice the path, but if you're not careful, you lose vision. Yeah? If you're not careful, because the nature of reality, because prajna, because the unconditioned, whatever unword we want to use, is very, very nebulous and inevitably can't be pinned down, it's very easy to lose touch with it and focus on lesser matters. Yeah? And Buddhism is, I think, particularly prone to this. You can just get into kind of good behaviour that's good and valuable, but with a loss of vision. Yeah. So I think that the real task is to notice that prefiguration of vision that you've already got. It's not that Buddhism is giving it to you, it's just pointing you to it and say, yes, that's it, you're onto it. Yeah. That's what it's doing. It then says, okay, well, you need to fashion your life so that you're more grown up. On the basis of that, you can meditate effectively. And on the basis of that, vision can start to open up to you. But I think the Buddha now would be saying, because it's a nihilistic culture, you particularly need to cherish your vision. Yeah? That's why retreats are so important, because that's where you experience it most. Because it's very easy to lose vision whilst actually still treading the path, to become a sort of good Buddhist, which is something, but not very much. Yeah? So that's my little warning to leave you with.